Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I wish to welcome our viewers to the North Idaho College Public Forum to a 9-week special series dealing with human rights. The purpose of these programs is to honor the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, which is celebrating its 25th year in its work for human rights and its struggle against hate. It's been a remarkable quarter century. On program number 1, we're going to give you a historical background, a historical struggle for human rights or civil rights in the United States, which is a prelude to our other 8 programs when we will recognize what that organization has done with the help of many others in the Pacific Northwest. To get us into this first program of the background of civil rights in America, I welcome Norm Gissel to the program. He's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and for over 20 years he's been on the board of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations and has championed human rights, and also was one of the victors in the trial of the Keenans versus the Aryan Nations. Norm, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Tony, and I'm honored to be here, and I think that this will be an informative series of programs of general interest to the Northwest.
You're our historian, too, on our board, and so let's start out by talking about civil rights in America in that terrible time when we had that awful sin of slavery that did not come to an end until the Civil War in the 1860s. And it started with the slaves being brought to this country, and then the Constitution was adopted, and it was placed in the Constitution. What would be your opening comment about slavery in America?
Well, first I'd like to make a couple of statements that are predicate to that. And the first is that throughout Western civilization, indeed most of civilization, there's been a series of civilizing ideas out there. And those are freedom, dignity, and equality. And when those ideas are present in a society and the government of that society adheres to those principles, that society flourishes. Slavery, in all of its manifestations, is one of the worst ideas that mankind has ever come across, and acts in opposition to all 3 of those basic human principles. Slavery early on in its history was slavery of the conquered by the conquering forces, whoever those might be. So Greeks could be slaves, Italians could be slaves, the French could be slaves. It depended on who won the war and who lost the war. And it was not until the, quote, discovery, end quote, of Africa by Western explorers, where they observed this huge pool of humanity that they regarded as living in a primitive state, that the idea of slavery became a race-based idea, and a pernicious idea made worse by racism was the slavery that we inherited in America virtually at the start of our country. When the settlers first moved here, we had slavery right at the very beginning, and we didn't get rid of slavery until the end of the Civil War.
If I can go on because of time, but when we did create our country and adopted the Constitution, and there was the debate between the North and the South, the fact that slavery was placed in the Constitution, there was no way to end slavery because it took 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of states to ratify an amendment. And is that what the number one reason why the Civil War had to take place? Because you could not, even though society was, a great part of society was going to say how wrong this was, it was in the Constitution.
Well, it was in the Constitution, and the way the Constitution was written, it weighted the strength of the southern states politically, while they only measured a African American as a 2/3 person, 2/3 of a human being. The way that
or 3/5.
3/5. The way that was understood was that it gave the rural, lightly populated southern states greater power when in the federal legislature. So it was when you enshrine in a document of freedom the doctrine of slavery at the same time, you've got serious problems, and those problems manifest themselves in the Dred Scott case, which was written as a constitutional way of thrusting Southern culture, which embraced slavery, onto the rest of the United States by finding that African Americans were not human beings and could be owned by white slave owners.
So, and for those viewers who might not be familiar with the Dred Scott case, that was the kind of the final straw that said that the Civil War would be coming, because the highest court in the land had indicated that their interpretation of the Constitution was that slaves were property.
It was an attempt to enshrine in the United States culture the Southern culture of slavery, and that was the ultimate irreconcilable act that inevitably led to the Civil War.
We just have a photograph up right now of one of the holding pens where slaves were brought to be traded and bid on, and so we can see the atrocities that came from all of that. A couple more questions on slavery, and that is, also it had an incredible, terrible psychological effect on where families would be divided, like a father could be sold and the other members of the family stay with the plantation where they were.
Right, and ultimately, as you study slavery, as awful an institution that slavery was to the African American in the United States, it also had the effect of enslaving the slave owners. They were equally captive of that system, as well as the entire culture of the South, as they embraced more closely the idea of slavery based on racism.
We also have a photograph of it's such a terrible sight, but it's showing a slave being physically beaten. And so there was also physical harm to many slaves through physical force to control them.
Right, but there's the torture and the tortured, and they're both bound up by that system, just like in slavery, and it got worse and worse and worse. Slavery doesn't get better; it only gets worse. So.
With the Civil War in the 1860s, and at the end of the war, the victory of the North, slavery was abolished, and of course President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Then we added the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and really changed the law in this country. But then we moved into a second challenge, as we're going through today on this program, the historical struggle for civil rights and human rights in the United States. We went through with the sanction of law, segregation. So would you share with us how, as we moved out of slavery, there still was a tremendous problem for the African American in the South, in particular, through segregation? And let's start with your thoughts on why could we not move from, or why didn't we? We did not move from slavery to total freedom by incorporating through law segregation in the South.
Right. What happened, as I understand it, and there's been lots of literature and a lot of history written about the period immediately after the Civil War, but we did have a period of time of extreme idealism, and we thought that as a country we were done with slavery.
With Reconstruction.
Yeah, with Reconstruction, and that with Reconstruction everything would be made whole, and that the African Americans who had just become slaves would somehow be able to reach an equal status
and vote. They had the right to vote.
And have the right to vote, and in some undefined way would find their own path through American culture and American society. Well, that simply didn't happen. Construction was reversed, and there again there was another Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that enshrined the idea of separate but equal, and that was, I think, was a case in 1889.
1896, yeah.
1896. And from that point until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, we had a system in America, particularly in the South, where there was a huge underclass of African Americans, and they were diseducated, and they were mistreated in every human way possible except through direct ownership. It was slavery without slavery. It was the cultural ownership of people without the economic ownership of people.
And added to that was this awful thing called lynchings that took place, and there were so many African Americans lynched during this period in the South.
Right. The lynchings was the awful cultural way that the South and even parts of the North had of enshrining Jim Crow laws in America. Not only did these on average occur approximately one a week for decades in the United States, these lynchings, but there was two effects that came out of lynching, and the first effect was the terror of having a person without trial be condemned to death by a group of people who were not judges, not lawyers. They were just people in the street that would decide to kill an African American or some other person for some alleged harm that person was alleged to have committed.
And we just shown a picture of the Klan, and so during this period of segregation, not only were there state and local laws, but also Plessy versus Ferguson said you could have separation of the races.
Right.
That they interpret the Constitution that way. But share with us, you were very eloquent on this, how the Klan was like the gatekeepers and established certain customs in the South that were very wrong.
There was, particularly in the 20s and 30s, there was a tremendous surge in Klan activity in America. And these Klans it was a national organization to be sure, but it manifests itself in the local Klan groups in the small towns throughout America, particularly in the South, but also in the North, in certain areas. And they were a service group of sorts, and their job was as gatekeepers of the racial and the culture of the town wherever they found themselves. And they would be the racial gatekeepers of this community, and in large measure through intimidation and through the actual commission of crimes, such as the lynchings and such as beatings and things of that nature, usually body crimes, but also property crimes. They received, for their efforts from the cultural elites of these communities, they received a free ticket to commit these crimes. And either through deliberate prosecutorial incompetence or the failure of the local law establishment to make an arrest for the crime that was committed, or through jury nullification, a Klansman in that period of time could commit a body crime on a black person with little chance of ever having a consequential criminal effect.
In case after case, when they would be tried, they'd be found not guilty.
Right.
So that was permission from the community and the jury to continue this insidious segregation. We also saw throughout the South signs, and I think they will show that, but there are signs where you had white fountains and fountains for colored people, or like on trains, there was waiting rooms that were for people of color, was separate from the whites. And again, they had permission through even the highest court to do this.
That's correct. And even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, it was believed by many people in America that the Jim Crow laws would just go away on their own. And of course, that wasn't the case at all. There was a tremendous amount of energy that was expended in the South keeping the Jim Crow laws alive, and that was the separation of the races in every possible way. And in fact, the Montgomery bus boycott was about when whites sat in the front of the bus, blacks sat in the back, and the issue was who sat in the middle when the bus was full.
Also, when they attempted to register to vote people of the African American community, they were given literacy tests. No one else was. Yeah. Sometimes it was not even given in English, or the Klan would show up and intimidate at the polls. So during this segregation period up until the 1950s and 60s, with not only Brown versus Board of Education, but others we're going to talk about, civil rights legislation, they were totally disenfranchised politically, and there was segregation in religion. The whole society was separate. One final question before we move on, and that is, in particular children growing up, what did that do to them psychologically?
Well, what the effect of all of this activity by the white culture, it was the culture that had all the money and had all the power and had all the political and cultural influence. They're acting out of these Jim Crow ideas, and that the white race was superior and the black race was inferior, impacted children all across the land, and many black children were convinced that they were indeed inferior, and they had received an inferior education. They were treated inferiorly. Their family members could get brutalized and sometimes murdered without consequence, and they were given the most menial of jobs. So naturally, or not naturally, but unnaturally, they assumed that they were indeed inferior, and worsening the culture of those communities.
Brown case pointed that out and said it affected their minds forever when they grew up in that. Let's move to the second half of the 20th century and the great civil rights movement. Of course, a really great kickoff of that was Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and along came later Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and other organizations. The NAACP did work, and the courts, and many other organizations. Let's talk about how that not only changed the South, but it changed the entire country and even worldwide, and Dr. King was recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. I want to start with, as the civil rights movement got underway, there was a real resistance by the Klan and others in the South, and we just recently saw the conviction, after 41 years, of one person involved with the death of the 3 civil rights workers in the South. Would you share a little bit with us about the death of those 3 civil rights workers?
Right. The Swerner, Cheney, and Goodman were inspired. Were inspired young men. One was an African American that lived in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the other 2 were from New England. And all they were trying to do was register African Americans to vote, because after all, there's great power in voting, and it was for the crime of acting like Americans that they were killed, and that was one of the many focal points, and that was one of the, almost like a tipping point of the civil rights movement in America. That was such an awful moment, and it was so dreadful and made everybody feel so bad. Even many people in the South felt terrible over this tragedy of these innocent young idealistic men working to improve the human conditions of Philadelphia, Mississippi. They were murdered for that, and those types of events, and there were a number of them throughout the South.
Others that died too.
Others that died. That slowly but surely there was this groundswell of all across the nation that we had to change. And one of the great movements, one of the other great events that was a positive force was the march from Selma to Montgomery.
And we're going to be showing that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But before that, there was in Danville, Virginia, a slide we have shows that there was a great rally there. And then I want him to move from that slide to, I want you to talk about that remarkable moment in 1963 when there was a great march in Washington, D.C., and over 200,000 people heard that great speech by Dr. King, the I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah, that was one of the... There's culture doesn't speak clearly on very many occasions, but culture of America spoke that day, and it was one of the great moments of American cultural history as well as American political history, and that was the moment that we all knew that cared about this issue, and that was at that time, in those days, most Americans, that we were going to win. That march said we're going to win, and even with shortly thereafter the death of Dr. King, the issue had been settled on that day, if not on it at an earlier time or two. We knew we were going to win, and that the culture of America was forever going to improve.
In addition to the Dr. Kings of the world and the Gandhis and all that were so powerful, students had an important role, and we're going to show a slide of students setting in at a lunch counter. So they had a great part in this civil rights movement and courage, did they not?
Yes, they did. And John Lewis, a U.S. Representative from the 5th District of Atlanta, Georgia, was one of the leaders in that. And what the sit-ins taught us, and which a number of us learned in different ways, and in my own peculiar way, I also learned that, even in Idaho, if you could roll back one tiny aspect of the Jim Crow laws, of the culture of the South, you could roll them all back. And what Lewis and that wonderful group of people that did the sit-ins, what they learned was that they could roll back these laws with respect to eating in a grocery, or in a department store or any restaurant in the South. And as soon as they learned that, then they also learned by inference that the whole apparatus of Jim Crow laws could come tumbling down.
And the Southern segregationists understood that, and they really resisted. We have a photograph, too, of Dr. King being arrested, and Dr. King and Jose Williams and others, Reverend Williams, who was here in Coeur d'Alene years ago, they really sparked a change, too, because, again, they were challenging in a nonviolent way those laws.
Right. And that was the other side of it. King wasn't directly involved in the sit-ins. He was, in fact, he was mystified at the sit-ins. But they all fit in a piece and were all important aspects of the civil rights movement. And what King was fascinated about civil rights, about sit-ins, was how you could change culture with just this one set of acts. And that's what was charmed King about that, and how he was fascinated by the sit-ins. And they were done without any input from King at that time. So that was a very empowering moment for everybody.
Another empowering moment is our last photograph today on this, in that you've talked a lot about Selma to Montgomery, Alabama march. And I think it started out with 4,000. By the time they got there, they had 25,000 people. Wasn't that a very turning point?
Yes, it was. And the Edmund Pettus Bridge is a small little bridge in Selma, and it's an arch bridge. And you stand on one end of the bridge. You can't see at the other end of the bridge. And it is metaphorically what we were doing when they marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Those brave civil rights activists. American culture moved with them, and we didn't know what was going to be on the other side of the bridge, but we knew we were going to have to transform. We knew we couldn't live with the Jim Crow laws anymore, that we had to unify once again and spiritually and politically and culturally join together to enfranchise millions of African Americans truly into American society.
That builds a bridge for us for the last 5 minutes of the program to get us ready for the next 8 programs, which are here in the Northwest, and focusing around the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. With these great victories in the South, then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and other laws that came and also affected other groups through the 70s, there was a tremendous change of who could participate in the political process, and there was a large African American population in the South and some other minorities. And so those who were wanting to keep a segregated society, or they was looking for a new homeland. And would you explain why the Aryan Nations and the KKK and the 11th Hour Remnant and other groups looked at places such as eastern Washington, North Idaho, and Montana, and North Dakota, which builds our bridge for the next 8 shows?
If you look at the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you look at that from the eyes of the Klan, it was a debacle. They had lost earlier in the 30s in the big cities in the north. They had lost elsewhere in the north. Indiana had driven most of the Klansmen out of there by that time. The Klan was defeated morally, spiritually, legally, and culturally. But as we know about the Klan, they don't give up so easy. And there was a cadre, there was a group of those people in the South that had lost this momentous situation in America, that they looked around for a new homeland, a new place. And what they saw was essentially from Ellensburg almost all the way through Pennsylvania and into New Jersey was a broad span, with few exceptions, of rural white America. And they believed that if their last stand in America would be in the rural white communities of America.
Up north.
Up north. And Idaho and Kootenai County was the first among those and was the best expression of this new set of racist movements that followed out of the Klan's civil rights losses of the 60s and 70s. And so they turned their focus to this community, and in a very determined way that went on for decades, were resolved to find a new homeland in white northern American society. And Kootenai County and the inland Northwest was their first primary and most important target.
And Richard Butler indicated when he arrived here that he wanted a white enclave in 5 states, and he earmarked those as Washington, Oregon, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. We know that, fortunately, he didn't have a lot of success, and that we'll be talking about in the next 8 shows. When the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations was born in 1981, and is still going at the end of 2005, had a real task on their hand with many other organizations helping. And so, Norm Gissel, we want to thank you for being with us, and we've built that bridge, I think, and you'll be back on some of those programs to talk about how the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations became known around the United States and even outside the United States for its struggle against hate, and many political leaders and other civil rights groups and civic groups and all joined in that. And so on those programs, we're going to be talking about not only the principles of freedom, equality, and justice, but we're going to spend a lot of time on tactics, how this organization led a number of communities in strategy to combat hate and to say to those that had moved to the Northwest, not in our communities will you set up and prevail. You might live here, but your doctrine will be rejected. And we'd like to talk about some crimes that took place and the great victories and, of course, the great trial that Norm Gissel will be back to talk about. Until then, I would like to wish all of you a great week and hope you'll be back with us in the other 8 weeks of this series on the 25-year history of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.